You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. Good to see you, Mike.
Great to be here again, Kate. They keep inviting me back to the hotel.
Solidly, you're permanently on the guest list. Me too. We're glad to be here.
I'm in platinum perk stage now. It's all good. I get chocolate on my pillow every week.
I like it. Well, it's another episode where we're going Rocky Mountain Best Western at Hotel Pacifico.
Yeah,
but I'll let you in. Go ahead.
A little bit of a BC Alberta crossover today.
Yeah. But hold on, Mike, because I'll let you introduce our guest in a second.
All right.
We'll do the rundown because Geoff is going to join us again in the strategy suite this week, where we'll dive into some of the ways opposition leaders are eschewing traditional political practices, particularly Kevin Falcon's disdain for polls and Pierre Poilievre's public rejection of lobbyists. And we'll end the show, as we always do, at the minibar, where we sometimes raise our glasses, but honestly, I think more often we take the shots. And this week, Mike, I'm actually really excited. Our guest brings a lot of perspective.
That's another way of saying he's been around a long time.
Exactly.
But I'm gonna cover some of the highlights here, and I'm sure other highlights will be inserted as our conversation goes along. Now, I first met our guest, Eric Denhoff, in 1992 in a boardroom or a committee room on the 3rd floor of the legislature, where I was a legislative intern with 6 other freshly scrubbed young people who were getting their initiation to the legislature, and we would meet a number of personalities around the buildings. And in came Eric Denhoff, who was then a deputy minister in the months-old NDP government, and he had gained some notoriety for being, I believe, the first deputy minister of the then called Native Affairs Ministry, I believe, or it was Aboriginal Affairs, in the late 80s under Minister Jack Weisgerber. And we'll get into Eric's background a bit more in a bit, but his rise to the top of the bureaucracy was a bit unorthodox, as I recall. The NDP kept him around for a while, and one of the roles he had was CEO of BC Transit, so we're looking forward to talking a bit about that today. And he's a chief negotiator for the Government of Canada and BC Hydro, spent many years at treaty negotiation tables through the BC Treaty process and other negotiations for private and public sector. He was the president CEO of the Canadian Hydrogen Association, which is the belle of the ball in some provinces these days. Then Rachel Notley is elected Premier of Alberta, and Eric is summoned to Edmonton, God forbid, to serve in a variety of capacities at the deputy minister level, including responsibilities in climate, environment, and market access. And that means jamming a pipeline to the West Coast over John Horgan's objections. Today, he's a consultant, who isn't, and a vice chair of BC Ferries. Ding, ding. Get our dings back. I'm sure we'll talk about that. He's also a frequent flyer on Twitter, or
now X,
and LinkedIn, and God knows where else. He's probably doing TikTok videos for all I know. Welcome to Hotel Pacifico, Eric Denhoff.
Thank you very much. I'm actually not allowed to do TikTok. My kids told me I can't do TikTok.
That's probably
TikTok-less.
Probably a good idea. Good idea. Did I get the highlights? Did I miss anything important?
No, I don't think so. I think you got more than enough.
Well, I've got some follow-ups here. Just, you can simply say confirm or deny.
Yeah, let's play the rumor game. Yeah.
John Diefenbaker was your landlord.
Yeah, he was. My dad was publisher of the Prince Albert Daily Herald, and Diefenbaker owned a house on, it was 19th Street or 22nd Street in Prince Albert, and he rented it out because he was in Ottawa. So we rented his house from him, and he. But I met him when I was 6 or 7. When my dad was editor of the Star Phoenix in Saskatoon, and Diefenbaker came to town, and I said, "Oh, I'd really like to meet the Prime Minister. That'd be great." So my dad said, "Oh, sure, I'll set it up." So oddly enough, I want to go down and Hotel Besborough and meet the Prime Minister, who bought me a chocolate sundae, which I thought was pretty well the greatest thing since sliced bread. I should have been a conservative by all rights.
Well, good Saskatchewan content. I think you went up Don right on that story.
Yeah, there you go.
Second question. You wrote a book called Retiring to British Columbia in 1986.
It was a bestseller. It was a Canadian bestseller. We sold, I don't know, 5,000 or 10,000.
So you're responsible for the housing crisis. Thanks for nothing.
It's all me. It's all
Thanks
me.
for that.
Me and the late Mark Krasnick, who was brilliant, and another fellow. We did. It was a lot of fun, actually.
Last question. You are, confirm or deny, you are the holder of a lifetime transit pass.
I'm not anymore. I gave it back. I was, everybody who had been CEO, plus the mayor of Vancouver, and forget who else used to get these lifetime passes. And I gave it back because I felt that it was, ridiculous to be given free ride, literally a free ride for your entire life. It seemed very odd to me.
It wasn't transferable?
No, tragically.
No, Eric, my opposition research file is bursting with clippings from Eric's past, and he did very publicly return his lifetime pass.
It actually, the better story though is when I was appointed as CEO of BC Transit. The NDP had come into power, and I was at a dinner with the deputies under the Socreds. We'd been appointed by Socreds as deputies. And a bunch of them were saying, oh God, the NDP are coming, we're going to lose our jobs. And I said, well, actually the cannibalism is the current government. They're killing us all. If you look at how many deputies have survived 2 years under the current government, the NDP would have to fire almost all of us to meet the same bar. So I wouldn't worry so much about the NDP winning. I would worry about the current guys getting reelected, because we don't seem to have many staying power with them. Anyway, NDP came in and they fired a bunch of my colleagues and suddenly realized they had nobody to implement their agenda,
Yeah.
And so they kept me around for a while, as you pointed out, and then traded me off to transit. So it was a very unusual time.
I want to come back to transit, but can I start with one of the really interesting things about your resume, and there's a fair bit, but one is the having served as deputy minister in Alberta and BC. And I'm wondering, how many of you are there? Are there many who have served at that level in BC and Alberta?
No. Well, not really. There have been a few, I think, but no. Alberta had the same government basically for 40 years, pretty much, when the NDP arrived. So they mostly were inbred quite heavily. And so, and also, much to my surprise, an awful lot of the senior, not numerically like a majority or anything remotely like that, but surprising number of them had served in ministers' offices and then parachuted into the bureaucracy and had become at very senior levels. So you had, and it doesn't mean they weren't capable. Many of them were extremely capable, even though they'd come out of the political environment rather than the public service. But you didn't have a lot of external. The only people who seemed to come from outside were generals. They'd brought in one. It was quite funny. I'd never seen this before, but they brought in one general who then brought in another general, another brigadier. And so there were 7 or 8 senior, ADM and deputy level people who'd been generals or equivalent in the Canadian Armed Forces, which was very unusual. A really talented bunch of folks for fighting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't encountered that in a public service.
I never saw
military coup we didn't even know it happened.
That's right. We didn't know it happened. Yeah.
So what's the biggest difference between the public service in Alberta and BC?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is that in Alberta, the public service had, having had the same government for, as I said, around 40 years, when government changed, they were totally incapable of contemplating, of grasping what a totally different agenda might be, because everything was a sort of a shade of the previous government. So you go from Klein to, somebody to Jim Prentice, and really, there are fairly small differences between them. I mean, they thought they were huge, but in the greater context, they're small. So they really had no idea what to do when a different government came to power. Whereas in BC, we changed governments fairly frequently. And so the public service is relatively nimble, not all of them, but you separate them into the senior civil servants who are very capable of understanding what the agenda of a different government is, and they're capable of implementing it. Some that are capable of understanding the agenda but can't implement it or won't. And then some of them are just incompetent, couldn't implement the existing agenda, much less a new one. And in Alberta, you just had a whole bunch of people that didn't have any idea at all what the new government wanted and how to do it. And you had a group of them who were quite stubborn and didn't want to help implement because they were, in fact, ideologically opposed. You also had a level of paranoia that I've just never seen in provincial government managers before. Like they would rather not negotiate for a $50 million federal program than take any conditions at all. Zero. I mean, the condition could be, we're going to send the money on Mondays. It'll come every second Monday, but it's going to come in money. No, we're not, forget it. We're not talking. We don't need it. We got our own money. Go away. Everything was a conspiracy by not just Ottawa, but a conspiracy by BC even. You know, for example, I couldn't understand why they didn't want to make a deal to export Site C power or, you know, for greater interties. Well, because then BC would hold it over our heads, and they would cut off the power to exert leverage on another topic. I said, well, we're not going to do that. You have a contract with them. Oh, you never know. So this level of paranoia that just transcended any common sense that had built up over many, many years of fights with Ottawa and others. So that was one major difference. Otherwise, I mean, it's very professional public service. They were very well trained, well educated, you know, very decent bunch, very good bunch, and particularly at the middle levels, very, very solid.
The Alberta BC relationship has, I can think it's gone through a few phases where Gordon Campbell and Ralph Klein, where I think we're pretty close. And during that time, the new relationship was formed along with Saskatchewan. A lot of interprovincial trade barriers were eased, and they're kind of took a team approach in building the economy.
Yeah, no,
by my time,
well,
by my time when Christie came around and Alison Redford was in the office, that's when there was a lot of friction over oil.
Yeah.
And Christie had advanced the 5 conditions for building pipelines that BC wanted satisfied, and that was hugely controversial with Alberta, which was great politics in BC for Christie, frankly.
For sure. No,
and then by the time you're in Notley's office, and Christie's gone, and Mr. Horgan is there, you'd think 2 NDP governments side by side, there would be that kind of synergy that was there under the, you know, Campbell and Klein. Didn't really play out that way because of oil, I guess.
No, it's just all oil. I mean, the problem was for the Alberta NDP is not the same as the BC NDP. I mean, the BC NDP is quite ideological by comparison, whereas the Alberta had never been in power, for one thing, and second, you could not exist as a party in Alberta if you didn't contemplate a future for fossil fuels at some level, right? So the differences are fairly profound, and Notley is very pragmatic, actually, as a leader, and it worked in BC, as you know, in the minister's office here, and that sort of thing. So the problem really became, the pipeline. The pipeline that was the end of that.
Well, it's and just this week, I think this month, anyways, the oil started flowing into Tidewater. What was your role there? What were you trying to accomplish in the market access role?
Well, I was the bad guy. I mean, you know, my job was to try and find a way to get the federal government to agree to get off their butts and do something. And the premier was very good at that. Didn't need my help. And second, to find technical levers to create opportunities for Alberta to get the pipeline through to BC. So, you know, it was a very, very contentious time. So the people don't understand that Trudeau and the public service in Ottawa, almost to a person, hate fossil fuels and hated the pipeline. And the only reason he agreed to bail out the pipeline when Kinder Morgan put it up for sale was that Rachel Notley promised to take down the entire national climate change plan that he'd put together framework if he didn't back it. And so he very reluctantly came on board and backed it. But that, of course, still left a struggle with BC. And for a time, we needed to figure out what things could be done to create a challenge for BC in continuing to oppose it. So, you know, could you do things like stop Site C in its tracks, you know, litigate around the downstream impacts of Site C? Could you prevent fuel from getting to access in BC? You know, the pipeline that comes now, the existing Kinder Morgan pipeline, of course, provides Vancouver with a lot of its fuel and its aviation fuel and other things. Could you muck with that, you know, and various other market access issues? But the biggest single thing I was charged with really was trying to convince the international community that there was a unique opportunity to back a government that had made such dramatic changes on climate change policy that we were doing things that made continued purchase of Alberta products palatable. And so we met with the big financial houses in New York, whose names I'll leave off. And we went through, you know, that we'd created a huge number of parks. So we'd set a limit on emissions, 100 megaton limit on the oil sands emissions, carbon pricing economy-wide, not just on industrial, but on retail, and, you know, on and on. was a very comprehensive plan. Energy efficiency, the largest and fastest launch of a program in North America, and that sort of thing. These guys were amazed; they'd never heard of any of it, and so they actually were very supportive of the financial community suddenly, because they were being harassed by their shareholders, of course.
Right.
But you have this Alberta NDP who are trying to get market access for fossil fuels at the same time the BC NDP is trying to kill off. I mean, kill off too hard, but trying to restrict and eventually transition quickly from fossil fuels. And so, and also very strong personalities, very strong person. I mean, John Horgan's personality is only slightly more stubborn than Geoff Meggs, so it's very, very, very challenging.
Jeff's a monster.
You know the truth, Eric.
Yeah. So, and Rachel Notley is a great pragmatist, but she's, pretty tough cookie herself. So, it was a very interesting time to watch because I'm not an NDPer. I mean, I've worked for everybody, Socrats, Liberals, Tories, NDPers. I like working for the NDP. They're kind of fun, but the Tories don't have much of a sense of humor sometimes, but Jim Prentice aside. But the thing was, as an observer, it was to me, I was quite surprised at the difference between the parties. It never occurred to me that you'd have this huge gradation of ideological difference from the same party, but you did. So
can we talk then about, because I'm also, marking the fact too that you led climate change in Alberta. I want to ask you about carbon tax.
Yeah.
And we're in this moment now where, and I think back to, some of what you were talking about, carbon tax was so popular for the fact that it brought in a predictability. It had an ability to put money back in people's pockets. And now we're in a place where nobody's standing behind it, but for Premier Eby. And even, in Manitoba, a new NDP premier has said no to it and is looking for alternatives.
Yeah.
Do you think this is a slow demise of the carbon tax in Canada?
I think it's toast. No, I think it's toast. Yeah, it's toast. Even if Poilievre didn't win, I don't think Trudeau could hold on to it much longer anyway. It's been a combination of missteps. I think one big misstep was the communications agenda around it. It was always troubled. It never quite was convincing to people. They never understood the messaging, the limited amount of messaging that was done. The second problem was that as the cost of living got insane, I mean, we're talking about a change of cost of living for a younger generation that's transformational, something none of us have ever seen really in our lifetimes, where suddenly our children have no hope of having the same economic status that the parents did, never getting a house, never, having an income sufficient to have a good middle-class life. So now you start telling them, not only is it bad now, but here predictably is how much is going to get worse every year for the next decade. It's going to yank this much more out of your gas tank. So not stopping the increase in carbon pricing and pausing it and saying, hey, until we get this thing under control, we're just going to freeze it right now at a minimum. Doing that was a big mistake on politicians' part, because you just give the opposition this never-ending rising tax to attack you on.
Do you have any ideas for Wab Kinew about what he can do, what else he can do?
He's done a brilliant job. I mean, here's a guy who's just super pragmatic NDP. He's running for election. He says, well, I'll drop the gas tax by 13 cents or whatever it is, the equivalent of what the carbon tax would be. And maybe I'll put it on later, maybe I won't, we'll see. So he'll probably take the hit. And by the time it matters, Poilievre will get rid of it anyway. Like, he might have to suck a year and a half, till the next election of revenue on it. But if I was him, I'd just leave it off, because he's not going to get a single vote back by putting it back on. And the revenue hit, it's not insignificant, but compared to the political hit he would take, people are really cruel to politicians who they love and then do something that they feel betrays them. So they absolutely love Wab Kinew now. Why would he do anything to upset that apple cart right now? If I was him, that's what I'd just leave it off, or let Poilievre chill it and be done.
I want to switch gears here to Indigenous issues, and there's a historic agreement signed a few weeks ago with the Haida that's making its way through the legislature. I'm actually not sure where it's at in the legislature. It might have passed already. I'm not sure. But did you follow the Haida Agreement? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny situation in BC. It reflects what the courts have been telling us to do. It's not a NDP construct. It's a very funny thing. I was the first BC chief negotiator at a treaty table in history, and nobody had ever been allowed to go before. I went to the Niska table as chief negotiator, and we did the Niska Treaty, and then subsequently a variety of others. And the reason we did them wasn't out of the goodness of God forbid, the social credit government's heart. I mean, these guys had a moral compass of a viper. So they did it because we were 50 trucks, logging trucks, lined up, up at Fort St. John in the winter in protest barricades from First Nations, and they were losing in court. They were losing injunctions left, right, and center. So finally, they had to get into the negotiating room. So the reality was the province of the feds have denied Aboriginal title forever, as you know, Mike and Kate. But suddenly the court found that there was Aboriginal title, albeit in a limited way, but it was there in the Silcotin case. That should have been all it took. It should have been no more question after that, that for a group like Haida, who have no overlaps, where the continuous occupation of that territory is unchallenged since time immemorial, they were going to win in court, hands down. In fact, they would have won way bigger than Silcotin. So, and at risk, because nobody's taken it to the courts before. The question of private property was at risk, because if the Haida had proceeded with a case that included private property and the courts found that there was private property on the table, oh my God, the whole province's economy is crap. So the beauty of the treaty process, it was based on a political deal with First Nations through the task force that was constructed originally to set up the treaty process, where the chief said, we're not going after private property. It's off the table. We're just talking about Crown land. Then in modern day treaties, it specifically excludes private property, and the governance authorities that First Nations have and their hunting and fishing rights and all that sort of stuff, other powers that they have, are over Crown lands, not over private property. So it was an elegant way of dealing with it. And they didn't surrender their title in the latter agreements, particularly. They just didn't assert their title in a way that was in conflict with the agreement. And since private property wasn't included in the agreement, it was out. And everybody was satisfied with, well, everybody was satisfied. Everybody in the legal community felt that was a reasonable solution. Where the treaty process broke down was the certainty provisions that provided that mechanism still didn't leave First Nations feeling that they had not somehow through a back door surrendered their Aboriginal title. You could go around it 100 times. And the conspiracy theorists amongst people still said, no, there's still, something missing here. So they started to pursue other avenues. And government, desperate for deals to have peace in the landscape for logging and mining and fishing and other things, started to do other deals, reconciliation deals and that sort of thing. So now you come to Haida, and the Haida say, well, we got title. Why don't you, either you recognize it or we're going to whip you in court. And they were going to whip them in court. So BC, the NDP quite correctly said, no, let's negotiate something. So at least we can try to keep private property off the table. And we'll have a negotiated agreement instead of, after the Silcotin case, it's half dozen years now, Mike, since that case. We still
have 10 years, I think.
We still don't know how forestry is going to be handled. We still don't know how highways is going to be handled. None of these agreements are any further along than they are in the treaty process. So it was, I thought it was a smart deal. It was a clever deal. And I understand some of the lawyers saying, well, they don't believe constitutionally that the private property is protected in the same way as it would be if it was under a treaty. I'm not a lawyer, I can't say, but Jeff Plant, who's no slouch, he was a right-wing attorney general under the Liberal, right-wing's unfair, he was a free enterprise government, but he thinks the deal's fine, constitutionally, legally, and I defer to him and some other commentators like him. But the reality is, imagine what would happen if the Haida had gone to court with private property on the table and won. With an uncontested.
So you're contending that's basically what the government gets out of this.
Yeah,
is that they're keeping the private property.
Out of
it in terms of a court decision that could have gone.
Exactly.
Because I was struggling to understand what exactly the government protected in the negotiation that was at risk in a court case. So that's okay.
Well,
that's a key thing there that you're raising.
Yeah, I think government generally in the last, towards the end of the Liberals and for much of the NDP, government abandoned the idea of actually negotiating as if you were two equal parties in negotiations, like a tough poker game, and began to move toward a model of recognition instead of saying, well, you don't know if you got title and we don't know if you got title, so why take a chance? Let's cut this deal, and then we'll both be happy. They moved from that to more of a recognition model because they were losing so badly. And once you do that, it's very difficult to hold the line. And so, where are you after a while? Well, the last thing left, really, we've moved to a model that provides for governance over a variety of areas. Quite rightly, it should be. Why should a bunch of white guys and women in Victoria be determining Indigenous governance over their children, for God's sake. That's insane. You know, we adopted them all up to Chicago and Denmark at one point. It was just stupid. So now we're in a point of where we're doing recognition. Once you're doing recognition, you're not negotiating, you're just recognizing what their rights are and then trying to figure out how they're going to be implemented. The negotiation comes around implementation. We used to be negotiating about recognition. So it's a quite different model. And I think on balance, it's a better model because, you know, for a First Nation to constantly every morning have to get up and prove that they exist in a legal sense is really wearing emotionally and psychologically and spiritually. Now they get up every morning and go, hey, you know, everybody's already agreed. We've always been here. We are here. All we're arguing about right now is the parameters of how we implement our rights. And I think it's healthier for society to have that, even though it's going to take us a long time to get through it.
Well, that discussion around the parameter of implementing rights got really hot on when the government looked at updating the Land Act, right? And in particular, I think a part of that was these kind of, it was two legal opinions out of big law firms, right? One kind of looking at, you know, don't worry about private property, it's fine. And the other one saying it's in jeopardy. I guess I want to ask, like, what did you make of those opinions? And do you think there's a way forward after the election for the government on that?
Yeah, you know, the funny thing is that in a broadly consulted basis in the treaty process, it's still going on. There's still some nations in treaties. They went from the government saying the treaty process was, you get a little bit of land that's bigger than your reserves, maybe 5% of your territory or something like that. The rest of it's crown land, and you get some consultation rights on it and hunting and fishing and that sort of stuff. That was the model, basically, Niska and New Channel and McDonald and others. They've gone from that model to saying, well, you know, actually, we might give you governance authority over up to 25% of the land, where no decisions could be made on land use without your approval, and you'd get ownership of 5 or, you know, X% or whatever. And then over the remainder, 75%, you get consultative rights in hunting and fishing, that sort of thing. Now they were very close to 50% when I last saw the table, you know, in the last year, where you'd have consent basically for decision making over 50% of the land base in a nation's territory, and then consultative rights over the other. And that was taking place in quasi-public. I mean, the negotiations were on a daily basis in public, but there was broad consultation. They were meeting stakeholder groups, and they were talking to fish and wildlife groups and all that sort of stuff. And people were kind of grudgingly going, oh, okay, I mean, I don't really like it, but I guess I can live with it. But when you transform that and take it out of those negotiations and drop it into an act in the legislature where there's no context, because there's context locally. People want it finished so they can get on with their lives and get decisions made and get that mine built or get that forestry tenure released to work and that sort of. You just stick it into the legislature in a bill. Yeah, I think people were, surprisingly, they were surprised. They shouldn't have been surprised. I mean, Kofi and Mining Association, everybody and their dog knows what's going on at the treaty table. But for whatever reasons, it landed with a thud, as you say. And it's unfortunate. The reality is people don't want to accept it. Like the world's over in BC for an old model where you could get up in the morning and as long as you could convince the EAO and the mining minister that your mine should go ahead, you were going to go. No resource project at BC is going to go ahead with or without the Land Act, without First Nation consent in some form or another.
Yeah,
I just don't see it happening. So,
well, let's take the example of a pipeline, or a transmission line, which are linear, which will cross through dozens of territories if you're going from one side of the province to the other. And there could be one nation along the route that objects to the project, such as some of the hereditary chiefs in the Wet'suwet'en objected to Coastal GasLink. Now, going forward, do you think how absolute is consent? How absolute is it a veto now, or are we still in a place where, as long as you've gone as far as you can to accommodate and seek consent, there's, you know, no one's rights are absolute here?
Well, they aren't absolute, but they're pretty close, except in the circumstance you can demonstrate it's in the national interest, for example, in the public interest. So if you were building a defense project, for example, you would probably win in court, you know, everything being equal, assuming it was, you could demonstrate it was necessary, because it's so clearly in the national interest. Is a pipeline to carry oil from Alberta to the coast, which industry provides, you know, 20% of our GDP or something, in the national interest sufficiently to justify going through that particular nation's territory with a pipeline? You're going to get into a facts argument in court. I would say maybe you'd win, but you win politically when you have 19 out of 20 Indigenous First Nations along the way who've signed on, because there's nothing different about that, arguably, about that 20th First Nation in terms of impact or their rights or other things that are so dramatically different than the other 19 that it looks like anything but jockeying or ideological, positioning. So I think the same thing happened on the Trans Mountain. Basically Squamish is still opposed to this day, maybe one or two others. The vast majority signed on. So the leverage that they have becomes undercut quite significantly. I don't think anybody in their right mind would try to do another linear project in BC unless it was along an existing right-of-way. Like the CGL, you can put another pipeline along there and probably cut a deal. Maybe one to the Niska for their LNG plant, but even that I'd be nervous about.
Existing corridor, yeah.
It's it's the cumulative cost of satisfying the federal environmental process, the provincial environmental process, and an ever-changing set of processes there, and the First Nations processes, which are not common between 20 or 30. They're each one has its own different view on how the project should be handled. So if they're equity partners from the beginning, sure, then probably you could move it along. But in the absence of having equity partners from the beginning, the costs are just staggering, absolutely staggering to accommodate those various interests. And most CEOs don't have the patience for it anymore. It's too much. You go to Mexico and build a pipeline in half the time. Yeah. I mean, I give you an example of how ludicrous it is in BC right now. I mean, how long ago was the fire in Lytton?
3 years ago. Yeah.
3 years ago. So there was an Indigenous community in the interior who also were swept with wildfire, destroyed dozens of houses in the community, almost obliterated it. They had it all rebuilt in like a year and a half. I think they got the first house started in Lytton or something.
Don't get me started on Lytton.
It's insane. So I don't think the country's broken necessarily, but there's certainly a lot of parts of it that are in need of some sewing together, no doubt. So
let me just pivot to another industry here where there's a lot of First Nations involvement. So we talked a bit about how there's growing equity, participation of First Nations, certainly in energy, oil and gas, but also forestry, other things too. But a new industry that is looking to be created in BC is hydrogen. Or newer, that's there now, but there's some big things being talked about. You were head of a National Hydrogen Association, or you have a lot of involvement in the issue. Now, McLeod Lake First Nations advancing a project up north. Lake Tenay are advancing a project with Fortescue and Prince George. And one thing about these projects, which Premier Eby has shown a lot of interest in, for green hydrogen, is they require a lot of electricity. What do you think? What's the outlook for hydrogen in BC? Do you think from the hydrogen production for export type of project? Do you see much potential there?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I mean, you can generate a tremendous amount of hydrogen virtually free by using off-peak wind power, off-peak solar power. BC doesn't have a lot of solar, but we have some wind, and we can add a lot of wind if we choose to. Right. And so you're taking wind that's not being, during the times of day, it's not being used to generate power for the grid because it's not needed, and you use it to create hydrogen. And you can then store it and transport it. The problem with transporting it is it's tremendously expensive to transport hydrogen so far. There are a number of technologies that promise to reduce that cost, but right now it's prohibitive to transport. And so, there's this prospect of exporting to Japan or other parts of Asia and to Europe. And I think it's possible, but we're not there yet commercially, economically. Where it's proven itself, I think increasingly, is in heavy transport, trucks, buses, trains. Forklifts, oddly enough, have been commercial for a decade, in the warehouses. They're way better than battery. And green hydrogen, I think, as costs come down for storage and transport, it will have a place. But this is tough slogging. I mean, I'll give you an example. I raised $5 million 3 years ago to invest in hydrogen and fuel cells. We've looked at 50 companies, I would say, roughly. And we found maybe over that period of time, 3 that we really thought, yeah, these guys really have something dramatically different and worth putting the shareholders' money into. And for one reason or another, haven't closed, either, inventor who couldn't give up control, or, the usual, issues with startups. So, and the board I have, they're all, unlike me, all know what they're doing, and very experienced people, and, a lot of business experience, technical experience, and that sort of thing. So, they're careful with their money around investing in it. So what we see is huge amounts of money coming in institutionally to big projects. And some of them will definitely make it, and some technologies will definitely work. But, you know, it's tough slogging. Ballard Power was started 20 or 30 years ago. And their share price was $100 plus at one point. Now it's down to $3. I think it's done that twice. And left a lot of unhappy.
They've had a lot of government support over the years too.
And a lot of government support over the years.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think the thing is now there's a lot more willingness to contemplate hydrogen as a solution than there has been ever in the past. So for sure, it's got a role. It'll have a significant role, but it's going to take some time. It's not going to happen tomorrow.
Why is hydrogen so expensive to transport?
Well, if you put it in pipelines, it's very light molecules, so it tends to leak out unless you've got really solid, you know, typically built for purpose pipelines. You can put it into a gas pipeline up to about 10%, maybe even a bit higher, and the end appliance won't be harmed. But you have to change it, you know, to liquefy it or some other fashion in order to move it long distances, unless you put it in a pipeline. So it's expensive to do that. You know, storage and transport are expensive. There are some kind of nifty technologies that are out there that promise to reduce the cost of transport, but they're at the sort of startup stage.
So
natural gas is very expensive to transport too, but you know, you have to have a big pipeline to get it to the coast, and then you have to have a liquefaction plant. So if you look at the LNG Canada, what's that, 36 billion all in? You know, it's very expensive.
Probably, and, maybe four.
But the spread was big enough that it by the time you got to Asia, you could still make good money. You know. So the question is, can hydrogen have that kind of competitiveness when there's lots of LNG ships out there? There's lots of experience building LNG liquefaction plants. There's lots of experience building natural gas pipelines. There's much less experience, not none, but much less experience on the hydrogen side. No hydrogen ships, for example.
Well, just so on this whole cocktail of energy and climate, and, you know, there's different strategies. I perceive that the Premier and his government are attracted to hydrogen because it's looks like a potential solution in the future. They're kind of a little skittish on LNG. They're kind of there, they're not there on the issue. But do you think, like, we have these climate targets for BC, for Canada? The industry argues, the LNG industry argues that, hey, we're displacing emissions in Asia. We should, you know, we should factor that into the discussion. Do you think that's a valid argument? Do you think we should be looking at it on that basis from BC? Because we're an exporter. To absorb all the export-based emissions into our emissions profile, that'll be hard to do, right?
At Hotel Pacifico, Eric, we call that the Ziploc bag versus the freezer bag argument. Are we do we need to account for the Ziploc bag of BC or the freezer bag of the kind of global atmosphere?
I mean, I think there's room for a bit of both. There's nobody's going to let us count give us offset credits for it. You know, that Daniel Smith and others proposed that
Article 6 or whatever it's called.
Article 6, it's not going to happen. Why would they give us their credits? It's insane. That's not going to happen. But I think intellectually it's reasonable to say, hey, the more the world's using the lower form of, not lowest, but a lower form of energy production, the better off we all are. I mean, if you look at the United States, the reason they've done so well in the United States is they got rid of coal. What they get rid of coal, what they got rid of it with, or mostly with LNG. And it was a dramatic reduction in GHGs from that one simple thing of mostly getting rid of coal with LNG. So is it as good as getting rid of both of them entirely all at once? No, but you have to be practical. And I think the reality is that we're in a trap where being practical may not be enough to save the planet, but it's all you're going to get. So.
Well, let me build on that a bit, because I mean, does the case get undermined a bit, like an LNG, in what the points you were making about green hydrogen and the kind of investment in infrastructure that's necessary to make that hard? Like, could you make a case that kind of the resources we are diverting towards LNG could be spent better where there's a less carbon intensive solutions that need that investment?
Well, I'll give you an example of the challenge. So if you want to go from fossil fuel car to a electric car, 5, 10, 20, 50 grand for a charging station, depending on what kind of charging stations you want. If you want to put a hydrogen fueling station in, it's $1.5 million. So when you want to put in, I don't know, 100 stations in the Lower Mainland, $150 million compared to a few $100,000 or a few million for electric, right? So cars probably, the equation is difficult for hydrogen. But larger ones where you don't need so many stations, you just need one at either end for buses or for trucks or for trains or whatever. They can compete, and we should be moving there as rapidly as we can. But that when people say doing that rapidly, it's still going to take you 20 or 30 years. I mean, it's nothing happens that fast. People, when I was trying to get the truckers in Vancouver Port drayage to do hydrogen trucks, they said, okay, so I buy this hydrogen truck for X, and you're going to subsidize it. That's great. So what's my resale value 5 years from now? Because I know exactly what the resale value of my diesel, truck is or whatever. Well, nobody has any idea. Nobody had the foggiest idea. It might be nothing. Well, that's not going to work for the truck driver. So, do you know in Vancouver, if you have a hydrogen car right now, you can't park it in the parkade. By law, you're not allowed to park them underground for safety reasons. And there's a gazillion of these teeny little things trying to convince the fire marshal you should be able to put a hydrogen filling station over there instead of over there. It'll take you a year and a half to work through city council or whatever. None of this kind of change happens overnight. So realistically, we should take advantage of the LNG that we have and the natural gas we have for as long as we can, while at the same time investing significant resources in things like hydrogen and electric and other, geothermal, all these other ones. They all have a role, and we're not going to get rid of fossil fuels in an hour and a half. It's just not going to happen. People forget whether it's Indigenous stuff or the climate change or other major social change, the support is a mile wide and an inch deep. Everybody's 100% for climate change, rapid as you can, as long as it doesn't cost them more than $100 a year. And even attaching a label to it is often death. So when I got to Alberta, a year before I got there, they'd had the election, the NDP had won. Just before the election, the NDP won. The Conservatives had raised the price of the fuel tax 4 cents at the gas pump. There wasn't a tweet about it. There wasn't a phone call to the hotline shows. There was nobody writing legislation. No, there was 4 cents, whatever. The NDP came in and put in a 4 cents carbon tax. Oh my God, the communists are going to kill the entire world, and oil industry's going to pick up tomorrow and leave Alberta. And so, some of this is how it's sold, and some of it is the impact on pocketbook. But no major social change can happen overnight. It doesn't happen.
I mean, policy is interesting that way. You can think of lots of examples, particularly at the provincial level. But sometimes, I like to say it's like a bit like, it's a bit like fashion. It's like all policy is a bit like fashion. It's all in who's wearing it. Right?
Sure,
like some people can pull it off and some can't.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a really
100%.
Can I pick up on something interesting? Because I'm listening to you, Eric, and I feel like I'm hearing themes of your approach as a negotiator. And I'll test this with you, but it's interesting as you talk about a lot of your discussions, as you talk about a lot of, work to bring progress on the files you worked on, you often talk about other people bringing their assumptions, their paranoia. I think you used the word conspiracy theories at one time. You're often talking about how one party sort of has an imagination of what could be the worst case in it, and how you're trying to walk that back. Am I hearing that right? Is that often something that comes into your role as a negotiator? Sure.
And I mean, with that also is usually the reality that the party you're negotiating on behalf of has a rosy view of the world that is insane, that everybody's magically going to sign up to their new policy prescription just because they should understand as well as you do this intellectual elite that's figured this out in Victoria. And they don't, of course. So, you take policy that's designed by wonks in Victoria or Ottawa, and you're sitting across the table with a group of fishermen whose lives depend on the outcome of these negotiations. And they're going to just as likely to pick up a chair and throw it at you as they are to listen to you drone on about the need for social change with Indigenous reconciliation. So, one of the most, I think, lacking skill sets in the public service actually is that ability to communicate and understand how the public actually thinks rather than what you think is good for the public. I think the reason I did okay in the public service was I spent years as a journalist first and in business. And so I understood much better, not like Ralph Klein did, but, like politicians who are, more attuned to the public do than the policy wonks in Victoria. I can tell them right now that's not going to sell. There's no way on God's green earth you'll ever get that past the politicians. And if you do, they'll die on their sword trying to implement it. And so don't take ground you can't hold, it's crazy. So yeah, you spend more time, in my view, negotiating with your own internal forces than you do with the force on the other side of the table. Almost always. The big negotiations are internal rather than external. Sounds crazy, but that's been my experience.
So your social media has been described as rambunctious. that you suffer fools poorly, that you have a sharp wit. So, playing
I
off
just
of
think I have too
that,
much time.
Do you
I take
deny
too
any
much
of
time
it?
there's all
playing
I
off of
do. I
that,
just have too much time on my
well,
hands.
what are
That's
you,
what-
as we wrap up here, what are some of your spicy opinions that you think today's public service, today's politicians should be heeding at your request?
Well, they should have called the election a year ago, for sure.
Yeah.
Mm.
I
When I
think
would say that
they
to
missed the
my-
window.
When I say that to my
Mhm.
NDP acquaintances, and I said, look, it's a great opportunity for the premier. You can say I wasn't elected as premier. I've got a different approach than Oregon. I
Yeah.
should take it to the people. You were riding so high in the polls. And of course, they were going, well, we can't ignore the election, a 5-year or 4-year election act, fixed date twice in a row. And so, of course, you can't. That'd be ridiculous. Anyway,
Did last time.
it did
Yeah.
last time.
But is there
I
a case
supported
that
it.
they use their get out of jail free card on that?
No, the public doesn't care. Fixed election dates, this electoral reform stuff is the biggest hoax. Nobody in their right mind. No, I don't know what overcame politicians that they decided that this would satisfy the great masses. Well, the people are mad at us. We have to give them fixed election dates. I never once in a bar, ever in my entire life, or in a coffee clutch or Starbucks, heard somebody say, God, if we only had fixed election dates. What a load of crap. Anybody with any strategic ability at all would go, hey, we're up in the polls, let's drop the writ.
Let's
That's what you do. If you don't want to have power in order to implement your agenda, get out of politics. If you want to have power to implement your agenda, you go when you got the numbers. It's just that simple. Meggs was smart with Oregon, dropping the writ. He locked out, though. COVID would have killed him if it was 3 months later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah,
Well,
so
that's a good one.
There's that. Public service, they should get rid of defined pension benefit plans. It's the single biggest barrier between the public and civil service right now. I'll give you an example. You have 2 teachers, say, which is not uncommon, a married couple. They retire after a gazillion years. It doesn't have to be teachers, it could be anybody in the public service.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a combined pension of maybe, I don't know, 150 grand a year, 125 grand a year. At today's interest rates, even at 5% interest rates, you'd have to have 2 or 3 or 4 million bucks of RSPs in the bank in order to equate to that pension. Who can, no small business group, nobody saving can ever remotely get a pension plan like that. It's impossible. And so you set up this conflict right off the bat between public servants as evil, people who have these great pensions, and the rest of the world that doesn't. And I think it's a mistake. And, I'm not saying take away from people who have it now, but start vending it in for new hires that they have a defined contribution plan like the rest of the world does.
What happens when no one can afford retirement?
Well, you can still afford retirement. It's just a different level of retirement.
Not everyone has a pension. They have to afford it now.
It's like the rest of the
your
world.
point. Yeah. Like the rest of the world, Kate.
Yeah.
We don't all have lawns. We don't have defined pension. Some of us are, we're out there
The old equation
trying to
was
survive.
The old equation was you had a low salary and lifetime job security and a crummy pension. And now what you have is really good salaries, pretty much still lifetime job security and fabulous pensions. That wasn't a deal the public signed up for. That sort of slipped. I don't want to go on about it, but I think that's one thing that probably we should take a look at, because it does create this divide that's unnecessary. Yeah.
I'll take.
Well, I mean, my notes, Eric, I think you've been too kind to the public service this time. Like, I want to say, like, we'll have to have you back sometime so you can actually dish on them a bit.
There's some great public service. I mean, one thing I learned when I went in, I thought they were all idiots, because I'd come from the private sector. But I came to realize that there were some unbelievably intelligent and thoughtful and careful people, particularly on the policy side and on program design. It's actually really hard to design a program that works, that doesn't screw up everything else that's going on. And we'll talk about energy efficiency programs and why they're the nightmare that you never thought they would be. Someday when we launched in Alberta, we had all these energy efficiency programs, one of which was giving you energy efficient light bulbs. And I said to staff, well, people have light bulbs already. What do we want to give? Well, the only reason you gave out the light bulbs was we installed them. We installed your frickin' light bulbs, because if we didn't install them, the Auditor General wouldn't count the credits because they didn't know if they're installed or not.
Oh my gosh.
Suddenly, of course, you had Albertans. You imagine going to a door in Alberta and saying, I'm here to install your light bulbs for you.
Yeah, the Auditor General doubting the wrist dexterity of constituents, I suppose. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well.
So there's stupid policy and there's really brilliant policy, and there's some great examples of that in Canada. So we can talk about the public service day and night. It's a very interesting topic.
Well, for today, we're gonna have to unscrew the light bulb
There you go.
And turn the lights out here at the Hotel Pacifico for this part. But Eric, thanks very much for coming in. Great tour of the issues, great insights on a whole range of issues, and appreciate you stopping by. And we'll hope you do so again another time.
I have to have therapy now because that's brought back all these memories that I thought I'd forgotten.
Guess I have been in and around education policy as a reporter, as a political advisor, as a parent for over 15 years. In that time, there has been a pretty significant shift in how we understand what it takes to help kids thrive. Certainly, the research and the knowledge have been around a bit longer than that, but it's taken that time for the system and for all of us, really, to begin applying practices that recognize kids as whole people. And learning is something more than literacy and numeracy. It shows up in things like the increased focus on mindfulness in the classroom, for example. Or the broad coalition of support that rallied behind the recent federal budget's promise of a national school food program. Okay, it had an assist from rising grocery prices. Still, I'm a big fan of this shift and of anything that recognizes happy kids are better learners. Which brings me to T-Dog. Again, not the Walking Dead T-Dog, as much as I love a pop culture reference with a post-apocalyptic landscape. TELUS Days of Giving T-Dog, which is kind of what makes TELUS, well, TELUS, by helping them deliver on their commitment to be the most giving company. Last year's event saw 80,000 volunteers in 32 countries giving back through more than 500 volunteer opportunities. An essential component of T-Dog is the Kits for Kids events, which will be hosted across Canada, including in Victoria. For many families, the rising costs of food and goods means that essential school supplies are simply not in the household budget. TELUS Kits for Kids program helps to fill that gap, providing essential school supplies to children and supporting families in need. Each backpack is filled with a pencil case, coloring pencils, HB pencils, blue pens, erasers, a flexible ruler, exercise books, and loose leaf papers. On May 13th, 2024, from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. at the Legislative Assembly in Victoria, MLAs, community leaders, and TELUS volunteers will assemble Kits for Kids backpacks and fill them with the essential school supplies students need. Since 2006, TELUS has distributed over 225,000 kits for kids across Canada, helping thousands of students thrive.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
All right, good to see you, Geoff.
Good to see you too. Fun fact, I was a reporter with Eric Denhoff at the Calgary Albertan newsroom way back in the day when I lived for a while in Alberta.
Oh, wow. I hear you have some harrowing stories about caribou or something.
No, those are Eric's experiences later in life when he was representing the Alberta government and going out to rural Alberta to explain to snowmobile operators and ATV enthusiasts how they could reduce their activity sharply to save a few caribou. It was a very tough discussion.
Oh, wow.
The next time we have him on, you should absolutely try to learn more, because there's a lot of public servants out there who go out there in the service of the public to explain ideas that the government has had and nearly get killed. And, Eric's a survivor.
Yeah, I don't think Eric went out there and said, I'm from the government, I'm here to help.
No, but that's how people portrayed it.
I think you would have had a more Denhoffian approach. So,
well, can we take a minute and talk some more about tough discussions and hope? Because Geoff, our colleague, our podcast colleague, Mike, was out at the Independent Contractors and Builders Association on Friday. I'm picturing it like Mike's like the crab, Sebastian the crab in The Little Mermaid, like wanting to set up the mood, to set up the Ariel and the prince and get them to kiss. And how'd it go, Mike?
Well, first of all, you've watched a lot of children's television in the last few years, but it's actually, if you wanted to be really cool, you'd be using a Frozen analogy.
Frozen analogy? Did they do a setup there?
Little Mermaid. Anyways, I could get into
stand by my references.
The international relations dimensions of Frozen someday. Now, ICBA dinner, yes. Now, it was actually Jeff's imagining of the situation where the two leaders would see each other from across
we're
the
talking
hall.
Falcon and Rustad.
Yeah.
Falcon and Rustad.
Yes.
Sparks would fly. They'd run into each other's arms and embrace. A couple of things happened that derailed that. Number one, the hockey game was on.
Oh.
And everybody was watching the hockey game, 1,000 people, and having lots of drinks, and weren't really thinking politics as much. Secondly, Falcon wasn't there. So he it was a long distance relationship.
But Rustad was?
Oh,
Rustad was there. Rustad was there. There were a number of BC United MLAs there, as well as including Ellis Ross and Todd Stone and Trevor Halford, among others. But there's no question that crowd wants to see. Many in that crowd want to see a more of a consolidated, coming together. But I'll tell you who else was there, Geoff. Tough Grandma. Tough Grandma was there too. So
Okay, better translate for our listeners.
yeah, Mayor Locke. Mayor Locke from Surrey was
Surrey,
there.
yeah.
So always good to see
Yes.
Mayor Locke. But so that coming together of free enterprise did not quite happen as we had imagined here in Hotel Pacifico. So we'll have to fix our big screen television that can foresee the future, and get IT down there to fix that.
well, according to the Disney playbook, all you need is a lagoon and some singing fish, and you're set. So we'll work on it. I'll give you some. We'll do a study session.
The
Little
problem,
Mermaid.
if I may segue, is that the lagoon, the BC United lagoon, is being drained
Oh, totally.
right now.
Yeah, good segue.
By the pollsters.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Let's wrap this up, because I think, or let's pick that up, because we're going to have a discussion of two related things. And it's really,
Yeah.
I'm going to liken it as, in both cases, what are the opposition leaders sort of challenging publicly? And so we'll start with Kevin Falcon, who said he doesn't believe in polls and has a lot of good reason not to believe in polls. One that might be more encouraging to him, that came out from Polera, right, is the rage index. Mike, can you tell us, like, what is this rage index, and why should Premier David Eby potentially be paying attention to this?
Polera, which is a firm I'm associated with, tracks rage, quote unquote rage, voters toward government on a quarterly basis, I believe. And basically, the metric is, I think, anger and annoyance with government. And it's been quite high at a national level, directed towards Prime Minister Trudeau, but provincial levels are, varying levels depending on which province you're in. But the graph they showed this week in BC was like a flat line that all of a sudden turns like a hockey stick, and a sharp uptick in rage in the latest quarter. Now, caveat, not a huge sample, because it's a tracking thing. I think there's only 200. So it's like, everyone be quick to say, whoa, that's a really small sample. True. But when we look at the other provinces as well, they didn't change much. BC was just noticeable because of big upswing. So it kind of lines up with what I think we're feeling, that it's been a rough first quarter for the government, that they've been beat up on a number of issues. And there's a general angst among voters about affordability and other issues that may be now manifesting itself at a very inconvenient time for the government.
Sorry, and when you say first quarter, you mean these data are about the first quarter of 2024?
I think that's April. I think they were in the field in April, and they were comparing it back to January.
I think that's important. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Geoff.
Well, I feel like we've been with polls, and this is true in a number of jurisdictions. You're driving down a pretty smooth highway, and suddenly you hit a horrendous run of potholes or washboard or something, and you're trying to figure out, is the road now washboard and potholes, or are we going to get back to pavement? I mean, it's still a bit all over the map here in BC, because on the one hand, we see Kevin Falcon vaporizing practically in a couple of recent polls, and one just the other day, yesterday, I guess from Dimitri Pantasopoulos, who's a very experienced pollster, in a memo to his clients suggesting that Kevin Falcon was, if not dead, then definitely resting. And as they say on Monty Python. But I think there's a lot of indication that's been steady for a long time for the NDP in overall approval, although concern on a lot of the issues. So we need to see a few more, I think, before we can tell what's happening in terms of the BC electorate.
So I'll take a minute, because Dimitri's numbers had the Conservatives at 31, the NDP at 29, BC United at 13, the Greens at 9, and then pretty big number, 18 undecided.
Yeah, that undecided numbers,
pretty consistent.
Huge, consistent. But if you turn that into decided vote, it's 37-35 for the Conservatives. So it's marginal lead on a poll of 600, and decent sample, not huge, but decent. So the other question in there was time for change. And I believe it was 53 time for a change versus 26 not time for a change. So they're getting into territory there that's, you remember Greg Lyle was speaking with us a month or two ago, talking about time for change numbers. If it gets to 60, it's a problem. And so that one was, Dimitri's is 53. And that's not including don't knows as well. So anyways, is there a problem here? There appears to be a problem for the NDP. Is it a terminal issue? I don't believe so. But this race,
Well,
I think we can safely say the race is taking on a new dynamic where the Conservatives are have emerged as in the polls as the contender. And it's tightening because in these this is a live phone poll that Dimitri did, and Main Street was IVR. Haven't seen an online poll lately that may show a different reality, but if BCU's being left on the curb and Conservatives are moving ahead, the race will tighten because the vote split will be less.
Well, I think that over time we've seen the NDP's overall support drift down, but it's still in excellent territory, generally speaking, with all of the issues that, of course, you've pointed to and we've talked about, Mike. But if you want to look at problems, consider the problem on the right-hand side of the spectrum. And whether or not John Rustad is even known to a whole lot of the key voters in suburban areas, whether he could actually pull together a team, whether he has enough money. And I don't say that because I think David Eby's in a difficult spot. I think he's had some really challenging weeks, but the problems facing the right-hand side of the room are very, very daunting. And the issue for Kevin Falcon is that this is his life. This is his career. He put everything on hold and came out of the private sector and came back into politics to lead the BC Liberals, then the BC United to victory. It won't be easy for him to even hear a conversation about what he might do differently before the election, especially when he's got a whole bunch of incumbents and front benchers, some seasoned operatives helping him, and a reasonable budget, although not as big as he would like. Whereas I think on John Rustad's side, you put his picture up on the wall and ask British Columbians who he is. Many, many, many will not know. And he's got to put together a campaign team in a very short time frame and try to create a cohesive message. I think that's problematic for him. So it'll be a very confusing and I think contradictory.
Yeah, you know what,
here.
Geoff, you're absolutely right. And I would urge the NDP to definitely not take this seriously. And I would urge a complacent approach in the coming months. Take the summer off to just relax. Premier's got a kid on the way. And, let's just celebrate the summer.
Well, I hope you're sitting down, Mike, because I don't think the NDP is going to take your advice. I'm going out there on a limb on that one.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I was just, I was trying to be helpful. But I look, BC United still have some chips to play here. They've got depth of people, experience. They got energy to bring to the table in terms of party activists and things like that. The question I have is, do the Conservatives really think they can run the table here? Or is there going to be an effort to coalesce just in some arrangement or another?
But when you're in that room, if you got like the ICBA room, are people wringing their hands, Mike, and going, this really sucks, I wish somebody would do something? Or are they saying Kevin Falcon has to go? Is there a direction emerging?
I think it's like something needs to happen. I don't think we're for most
prescriptive
average people aren't too prescriptive. I just think as the NDP diverges from this idea of the acceptable place of organism that existed that people could accept, Eby's taken on a different character, this government, and I think as the poll numbers tighten, it creates a greater appetite for people to think, hey, we should get it together because we actually have a chance. That didn't look like that was there 6 months ago. And we don't care how it's done. And I don't think people are saying, we got to get behind Rustad, because to your point, no one really in the public, no one really knows Rustad. Most people couldn't name the leader of the Conservatives, but he's the guy that picked up the brand, and he gets to roll with it. And now, who knows? I think potentially we're in the, I mean, who could have predicted this 6 months ago? I think there may be some little twists along the way yet. Why wouldn't there be?
No, I'm sure there will be. Yeah, there have to be.
Well, but in other twists, I mean, what are the kinds of numbers, Geoff, that are going to prompt the premier to call it early?
Well, I don't think he will. I mean, I think Eric Denhoff made the point that others undoubtedly made to Premier Eby that, hey, what's the big deal here? And I agree with Eric that the public will forgive you, because what are you doing for the public here? You're giving them the chance to vote now. You're not denying them anything. So although there's always, a roar of outrage at snap elections, those who are taking advantage of them are usually forgiven by the public. But to do that at this stage, when he says so forcibly that he wouldn't, creates a bit of a credibility issue. And, I think we'll see. I mean, it could do it, but it's now quite a time since he took over from John Horgan. And Eric's argument was, okay, I don't have a mandate. I've brought in a budget, or whatever the timing would be. You'd say, okay, I've had a chance to show what I can do. Now I'm going to go. But he was always close enough to the fixed election date that it posed a bit of a challenge for him. And from everything he said publicly, he's determined to go to that date. So I think that's what's going to happen.
So just on the free enterprise side of the spectrum, that things that I've noticed in the past few days here, there will be some fantastical ideas, and then there'll be what might actually happen. But there are various fantasies happening around our former guest, Mayor West, who's profiled in the Vancouver Sun. I see my friend Katie Merrifield tweeting about it, musing about him as a future premier someday. When would that be? So that suggests to me that, opinion on the free enterprise spectrum is not nailed down right now in terms of what people think ought to be the best path forward. Brad Zubek, who is known to many in our audience, who has worked for many different political parties in his storied political career, he put out a tweet yesterday saying Kevin Falcon needs to pick up the phone and call John Rustad. Now, Brad Zubek's just one voice. He's run a lot of campaigns, but the noise is picking up, right? And there's a lot of chatter going on, and people are wondering what's going to happen. And there's different scenarios, this way, that way. Right now, the Conservatives have a lot of the cards because of the polling numbers, but BC United also has its own chips to bring to the table. And, if there was, in my opinion, if there was a coalescence where a vote split was removed, that's bad for the NDP. So now, having said that, there's a breakage fee, if you will, that if there is a consolidation of BC United and BC Conservatives, there are some Liberals who that is a bridge they will not cross. And there's an NDP gain with some of those voters. But the question is, where does it all fall out? Is this going to be a binary two-way race with the Greens panting far behind? And how's it shake down? So it's interesting times.
You raised some questions in my mind last time we talked about merger. I tried to figure out legally how that would work, whether there was a chance for that, how it could happen. I mean, there's the practical and personality parts to it, but the legal aspects are not trivial either, because if you have two parties that are registered, they've got candidates in the field, the longer time goes on, the harder it is legally for them to shift resources to each other or even to cross endorse. If you had a situation where somebody, Kevin Falcon resigned, a new leader of the BC United said, okay, we'll not run against certain key candidates, or whatever kind of, fix was attempted, you would run into a lot of difficulties, I think, legally in terms of cross endorsement and spreading resources around and that kind of thing. It's not that easy just to wind up a political party. Easier to start one than to wind one up.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And I don't think merger is can be contemplated. I don't
even
think
a mutual non-aggression pact is
frame.
pretty hard.
Yeah, you're right. But, that's why people need to, if they're going to do it, they have to have these conversations and figure it out. But, what will happen is if the Conservatives do in fact emerge as victorious in this primary between the two parties that's taking place, the money's going to dry up. The money's going to go one way. It's not going to go both.
Mm-hmm.
And that will have an impact too. So, I mean, I think for a future discussion, the Conservatives, if they do emerge in this position, they have not gone through anything yet in terms of the scrutiny that they will have to withstand. And they are run by a small number of people, and they have very little experience, and their durability is a big question mark. So are they building something to win, or are they just building something to get ahead of BC United?
Yeah.
And
Well, I think
key
for the
question
NDP
is winnability at the end of the day.
But the potential for the NDP is once the situation becomes a bit more crystallized, which it will be by the time everybody's sort of settled into finished their nomination races and so on, as the NDP can point out that this right-hand side of the spectrum can't agree on who should be in power, but they've always agreed in the past about what should happen to working people and to social services and to a whole bunch of environmental protection regulations and so on. And we'll be able to bring that issue forward very forcefully, I think, as we get people paying more attention to the vote. So scrutiny is one thing, but also, the Premier's in a good position to remind people about where some of these political leaders on the other side have been on issues like housing. And I've always thought, and I have a lot of respect for Kevin Falcon, but having had a career as a developer is a uniquely difficult qualification to have when everybody's worried about housing affordability. It's not a great resume builder if you're trying to convince people that you're really going to find a way to help working families get into a house. So we'll see, but it is very even more turbulent than I thought it would be at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely on Kevin Falcon's part of, not plausible. You're not looking at the polls, but I think the point that is absolutely true is that he's trying to make is that these numbers do not reflect a lot of truth and a lot of machinery behind BC United. That's going to play out very differently, riding by riding, with incumbents, with more money, with existing machinery that we know will play out, and doesn't factor into these raw numbers across the province. So
yeah, now I'll just end this part of the discussion by saying what's different this week than last in terms of the psychological warfare going on with polling is the pollster. And Dimitri is highly respected within BC United grassroots. He was the pollster who helped Christie get elected in 2013. He's not a fly-by-night. They can't dismiss him as a fly-by-night pollster. They have to deal with Dimitri, right? And so that's, to me, that's makes the argument harder.
All right. From psychological warfare to a clipping. So this week's clipping is, everyone's talking about it, the leader of the federal Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, writing an op-ed in the National Post that business leaders in Canada need to stop hiding behind their lobbyists because, quote, sucking up to anti-resource, high-tax, big government politicians has and will bring more anti-resource, high-tax, big government policies. Vancouver-based tech gets a shout out for not taking the government to task for blocking Frontier Mine, and the Business Council of Alberta and others get called out for too much politeness and hors d'oeuvre. Mike, do you think this criticism is fair? Pierre calls out Alberta. Does it apply equally to BC?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of things about this op-ed. It's very interesting. Should the business community who are pursuing certain policies advocate for it publicly? Yeah, I agree with that. I do think I've been in government before where people walk in the door and say, please do this, but then they're not willing to stick their chin out and do it themselves. So I totally relate to that. Geoff, you've probably seen that too, from either the right or the left, right? Now, I also see this as a strongman tactic of someone who is basically trying to impose his, imposes on the business community and setting a new set of rules. And, one of the quotes here is, if I do pursue your policy, I expect you will continue to advocate for it with those same Canadians in those same neighborhoods until the policy is implemented. Warning shot across the bow on that too. And I think there was a collective, inhaling going on when that op-ed came out, and a combination of corporate comm shops thinking, do we have to do something differently here? And consulting firms thinking like, is he talking about us, or do we have an opportunity here? So there's a lot of like, what does this mean for us? But Poilievre's putting it down, and there's a lot of lobbyists that are on his campaign team as well. So that's a bit ironic.
I think that's the biggest risk in this, right? So I don't think that corporate Canada was sitting going like, do we have to change? I think they were going like, you do you, man. Give us the like regulatory relief we need, and you can call us whatever you want in the National Post. And I think it's a really good strategy on his part, I think, to shore up what is his biggest weakness, right? About being too, conservatives, carry this baggage of being too kind of pro-business. And in this moment in time, it's really untenable, which is interesting, which is why I think there's a case for a dueling op-ed. I'd say probably Jagmeet seems better positioned than the prime minister at this time to do it. But then, to say like, hey, Pierre Poilievre, like, I don't think corporate Canada needs to tell voters what they need right now and motivate them to tell them what to ask for. I think, corporate Canada has to start listening to people who are paying the price of inflation with, struggling even more to pay their mortgages and to put food on their table. And then, seeing record level returns for shareholders. Like there's a way to turn this on its head and call out some of the flaws in the messaging for Pierre Poilievre, but also just a good move. Everyone's talking about it.
Well, I think Poilievre's inoculating himself to some degree from those attacks.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I think, it's tough for Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats to figure out precisely where to go in this, because on the one hand, you see Poilievre overtly appealing to hard hats and people who visibly present as working class with a capital W and a capital C. And so he balanced that off. I think, listen to some of the commentary from Ottawa, and this is relevant to BC because certainly a lot of this is helping float John Rustad's boat, and Dimitri Pantzopoulos says that as well. So we got to keep an eye on it, because I think the attack on the corporate sector, I read against the backdrop of the capital gains changes, which the federal Liberals hoped obviously would engage them in a great debate against the privileged with Poilievre paying the supporter. But he did two things. One is he said something that a lot of us in government have wanted to say to lobbyists for, sometimes weekly in my case, which was, especially some of the business associations. And that had changed quite a bit when I got back to government from when I previously had experienced it in the 90s. But the business associations have a tendency to say, we feel awful, and therefore you should feel awful because we're very important, and you should do what it will take to make us feel better. And what Poilievre is saying is, no, you've got to convince Canadians that that's a problem. But the second thing he did, it kind of reminded me a bit of Gordon Campbell, because when Gordon Campbell won a massive majority, one thing he would not do, and he had told, my understanding was he told the business community in advance, is he was not going to change the labor code to get rid of the anti-scab law. In his mind, this was a line he would not cross, not because he loved the labor movement, I don't think he did, but because he did not want to hit that beehive with a stick. And I think Poilievre did a bit of that last week too, because he really made it clear that he's driving Trudeau out. He's not going to sit and coast because he's doing well in the polls. He's going to go in and pull down the pillars of the temple if he can, call him a wacko, get thrown out of the house, tell the business community to shape up or ship out. And so it's a very aggressive period, and it may mean that things happen faster in Ottawa than the fixed election date would suggest. You never know.
Have you ever noticed I can go on and on, weeks on end, in fact, about energy efficiency? Well, let's talk now about what that looks like in practice. Fortis BC has embarked on a $50 million project aimed at uncovering the best pathway to reduce energy use in older homes and multifamily housing units, an essential step in meeting BC's climate action targets. This is important because older homes and apartment buildings pose a complex challenge, as a significant number were built before energy efficiency was incorporated into the National Energy Code for buildings over 25 years ago. Fortis BC is working to improve the building envelopes and mechanical systems of 20 homes and 4 multi-unit residential buildings across the province. The goal of this pilot is to reduce their energy use and associated GHG emissions by at least 50%. As far as I know, this is actually the largest targeted real-world study of deep energy efficiency upgrades that has taken place in BC homes. And let's not forget that buildings account for over 10% of BC's greenhouse gas emissions. Fortis BC will analyze the energy reductions, customer experience, and overall costs, helping realize energy efficiencies with home and building owners in ways that might have been out of reach before. Hey, Fortis BC, maybe you should analyze energy efficiency at Hotel Pacifico. Some of the opinions here can sometimes be highly inefficient. Fortis BC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
Well, I want to raise a glass to someone who's not in politics but played a super political role, and that's Assistant Commissioner David Taboul of the RCMP, who held a huge news conference announcing that they had arrested 3 suspects in the killing of Mr. Nijar in Surrey, which is going to be a very, very important story politically, both in BC, I think, provincially and nationally. So in a period when the RCMP has been having its ups and downs, to say the least, and I'm not going to mention Surrey, this was a big deal. And Taboul has been in a number of huge news conferences since he came on the scene, involving contraband cigarettes and things like that. So I don't know whether it's his team that are giving him these great opportunities or whether he's leading them to these new opportunities. But this was a good piece of news from the enforcement side. So here's to David Taboul of the RCMP.
Great. Mike?
I'll take a shot.
Yeah.
Kind of unrelated to all of our topics today, but something that just came up in my thought bubble. The legislature is about to wrap up in BC, and I had the exciting opportunity to watch estimates the other day on the live feed. And, you got MLAs in there on their laptops and looking at their phones. And I think it's time to take the screens away. I'm channeling my parenting skills here. Say, let's take the screens away. Take the screens away from the MLAs. Get rid of the desks. Bring in benches. And I think Mike Farnworth was actually talking about this at some point. I mean, the legislature's going to 93 seats anyways after the next election. They could barely fit those desks in there. But let's just, if you're in the legislature, you're there to speak, listen. If there's only 12 people in there, fine. And then get the hell out of there. And let's just get rid of the facade of having quorum when people are just doing their emails. So anyways, that's my grumpy take today. Let's go to the British. Let's be more like the British House of Commons and less like, everyone doing their homework.
Well, and if the kids can't have them, the MLAs can't have them.
Exactly. Take away the screens.
Keep it fair. Keep it fair. All right, I'll do a quickie just to say I was at the luncheon today for the newish president of UBC, Benoit Anton Bacon, who opened up beautifully at this Greater Vancouver Board of Trade luncheon with I'm new here, but how is there not a SkyTrain line out to UBC? Like, I don't get it. And I completely relate to that. And then used the bit the whole time throughout the luncheon, like kept coming back and like ramming it in there, that reference beautifully. It was a really good kind of, having kind of, there were some senior deputy ministers there, I think, who got to hear over and over again some pretty entertaining and robust support for that UBC line. So well done, President Bacon. My glass is raised to you. And now that wraps us up for this last fantastic episode of Hotel Pacifico. Thanks, Geoff and Mike. I want to thank Eric Denhoff for joining us, our guest today. And I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS and Fortis BC. We will see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Check out time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.